Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Capes and Lunatics. It's me, Phil. Kristen is here, and we have two special guests because, DG Chichester, Mr. Greg Wright, because we are going to talk the life, the career of Mr. Jim Shooter, who passed away not too long ago. So I thought it'd be nice to actually talk to people who actually knew him, work with him, because, you read stuff on the internet or you hear stuff and you're like, what's true, what's not. So
everything on the internet is true, Phil. Everything.
Oh, really? Okay.
Every single thing, yes.
It's true.
To the person who posted anyway.
So anyway, yes. From what I know about him, I know he comes from around my area, around Pittsburgh. So I know that. And he got into the business early. Didn't he start it at 14?
13 is when he started, but I think 14 is when his first story was actually published, and they had no idea that he was a kid.
Right.
So
that's the story and the truth. So
that's the same. That's the story. We all have heard that story. I'm sure it's true.
The urban lore.
Well, it's even on Wikipedia, so there you go.
Yeah,
there you go.
True.
Yeah.
And God knows somebody would have corrected it if it wasn't on Wikipedia. So Wikipedia may be the last bastion of sanity, that there is a self-correcting virus on it that will fix things up like that.
That's what the internet needs, a self-correcting virus. But yeah, so he started at DC, right? But I mean, most of his career, well, not the whole career, but a large chunk of it was at Marvel, correct?
Probably the most important part of his career was at Marvel. Yeah,
The most important part, I think so. I mean, I think that's what he's most identified with, and I mean, that was my experience, with him, was knowing him through Marvel. I was sort of familiar with the name, no idea about his, pedigree or background, but I mean, when I got there, he was the guy.
Editor in chief?
Editor in chief, yeah, at that point. So I mean, did he even start as an editor, Greg? Or did he just come in as editor in chief?
Yes, I think he came in. He was, it's one. I believe he was an editor at some point. I mean, or he either came in as an editor or as a freelancer, because he'd already before he shoved Archie Goodwin aside to steal his job. I mean, took the job Archie didn't want. People were already not thrilled with him in the creative community, but not nearly as much as later. But like anybody that comes in charge, somebody's not going to like it. So there were people that were accustomed to because there was I don't even remember. It was 4 or 5 different editor-in-chiefs who had put Marvel into a lot of problems. The schedules were blown, and there were a lot of writer editors just doing whatever the hell they wanted. So when he did come in, that was the whole. When he did take over, that was the whole point, was for him to as they say, get the trains running on time, to sort of get rid of the chaos, and he did that. But I don't know if he was an actual editor or because I don't think. It's like when, Len and Marv and Roy and all that, they didn't, I don't know if Roy was an editor, but I don't know if Len and Marv were.
Roy also created Wolverine, I hear. So
he did.
But what does Wikipedia say, Kristen, about Jim?
I'm glad you asked. Wikipedia says.
I'm actually curious. I'm not sure if I didn't know him as an editor. I don't know anything about him as an editor. He was always the guy in charge when I was there, until he wasn't.
He joined Marvel as an assistant editor and writer on January 2nd, 1976.
Okay.
Sure.
So
you all must be so youthful. See, you weren't working then.
And then leapfrog to editor-in-chief. Amazing.
Before you go on, I'm gonna ask a silly question, but is editor-in-chief the top person? How many people are above that person? Or is that
the top editorial person?
Yeah.
But then there's publisher, and then there's president, so then you start to go up in the in the business hierarchy,
okay.
But
then there's the salespeople, and that's a whole other
right. So that's like
Tried to take over.
in a related.
That's like top of the
position.
writing stuff.
Right, and I think as Greg was kind of getting at, there was a some editors exercised more control by fiat or personality. Some were more buttoned up by nature, some were more kind of all over the place. But when Jim became editor in chief, my understanding is that's at a fairly young age. I think he was still pretty young then. Right?
I think he was like 28.
28, I want to say, right? Which is
He was 20. I mean, very young to be in
Right.
charge of a company, and I think he was, and I believe it's when he took over, unless it happened later, he was also made a vice president. So because he had a lot of power, which was
yeah.
the problem that later, because
But
the people in charge weren't thrilled that he had power.
But I think a lot of the things you and I, and whether these came from Shooter's influence to some extent by the time we got there, having discipline among an editorial group is important. I mean, you Greg and I would argue that that's you can't really run a line of books, you can't run a company, you can't run all the crazy personalities without the discipline of schedules and on time and bonding with readers, through that type of thing. So if he had to make, the enemies he would certainly make later were for many reasons, some of them, quite valid, but that sort of stuff was totally necessary to any company, let alone Marvel getting on track.
Well, the writer editors were the first ones that were irritated because you had editors who were writing the book, so they had complete control and they were kind of doing whatever they wanted.
Right.
Which, of course, I would probably do the same thing. But, somebody's got to say, hey, wait a minute, you just wrote shit. So we're going to publish that shit. Whereas if you're a writer editor, you're going, well, I don't think it's shit. Well, and again, they were picking and choosing. And you can kind of imagine, that how that could be a bad thing. I think it was a bad thing to have writer editors. I think everybody needs to have an actual editor looking at your stuff so that you don't get too self-indulgent.
Yeah, that still amazes me. You look at some of those old books, and it's like, the guy who's writing it is also the one editing it. And it's like, okay, there's no oversight there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, essentially.
It worked in the old westerns when somebody was like the postmaster and the sheriff and the librarian, so they figured same kind of thing.
But yeah, I mean, you do talk about, rubbing people the wrong way. I mean, he did. I mean, whether they liked him or liked it or not, I mean, he did have strong opinions on a lot of things, right?
Yeah, and those opinions, I would argue, again, in my experience, is not the same as other people's. But I think at the base level of some of the things that he was insistent about, introducing characters, by name, establishing what they're about, making sure the story, functions in a certain level of conflict and whatever. Like, these are all base tenets that you should, have an allegiance to. But the problem becomes when you become so draconian, perhaps, about the way that is executed. And if that insistence, is at odds with other ways of achieving those goals, but maybe not the way that you would achieve them, then that is where you run into problems. I think. I mean, Greg, you had more experience with that than I ever did.
When you could read his blog, but you're going to have to eat a block of salt with it. When he talks about the things that he was trying to, force people to do, it all sounds completely logical, every bit of it. But I kind of look at it as there's what you call like the kindergarten book to how to do comics, so that you're telling the story clearly, so that you're introducing the characters and all that kind of stuff. And that's great. Every new person needs to have that. But he took it to this sort of extreme of there's only one way to do all of these things. And that one way was his way. Because after Secret Wars, he decided that he knew better than everybody about every way to do everything. And he would literally tell editors, my version of the character, the way I wrote it in Secret Wars, is the only way to write this character. I have written the definitive version. And it was the way he did it, because he did it in a threatening manner, so that people were terrified to try things. It's like, because when I came into Marvel, I came in through Dan at Epic, and I I had Dan's experience about who Jim Shooter was. So that's, I had a very positive expectation when I met him. And when you meet Jim Shooter, I don't care when you met him, he's an impressive guy. He's incredibly good he was always very good with the fans. He's actually quite charming. He's very smart. He's very talented. But, he definitely was very much of a micromanager. But I came into Marvel, and I just started getting the sense that there was a lot of cracks around Jim Shooter and all the other editors, including, our boss, Archie Goodwin. Because like one day Shooter came in to bark at Archie about something, and Shooter like literally ran out of the office with his tail tucked, because you did not really mess with Archie. And which was just kind of bizarre. And then very quickly, we started seeing Mike Carlin was fired because he dared to say he wasn't the guy to be editing X Factor, which had turned into a giant problem. And then Jim Owsley was fired. And then Elliot Brown and John Morelli were fired. I mean, it was like this rapid fire succession of people who were not doing as Jim Shooter commanded. And Jim Owsley was, like his little acolyte, acolyte, how do you pronounce that?
Acolyte.
That. He
go.
desperately trying to please Jim Shooter, including firing Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz off of the Spider-Man book because Jim Shooter manipulated him into doing it. So editors were terrified because you just didn't know which thing are you going to do that is going to get you fired. And everybody, and we weren't making any money at that time on staff. So people that were there loved their job. They loved Marvel. They loved working for comics. And that they were terrified unless you were working in Over at Epic, because he did seem to leave at that time. Archie, Shooter left Archie to run Epic the way he wanted.
We never had any issues ever.
And that was the thing. While I was Epic, I was like, well, I don't understand all these people having issues. And then I moved over to the Marvel side and I went,
Right.
I mean, was that because he was like protective of the brands? Because it's like, Spider-Man's on lunchboxes and T-shirts and.
Well, that would be the logical thing. I mean, you have to be protective of the brand. That's a whole thing. It was, things like, oh, I don't, this artist is drawing characters who are breaking the panel border. I'm going to fire you because you used them. Or I don't like the way this artist draws this stuff, or David Mazzucchelli drew a couple panels in the Frank Miller Daredevil thing that he drew him a little more abstract as a storytelling point, and Shooter lost his mind over that. You're
Right.
really, and Shooter was a guy that championed Frank Miller. I liked his work, but it's like nothing seemed to be, safe. So editors were constantly telling creators not to do certain things because they were terrified if they did it and they showed it to Jim would fire them for allowing them to do it, or they'd fire the creators.
Right.
I mean, it was a lot of fear on that side, and it was very toxic. And when you've got a group of people, and it wasn't every editor. There were editors like got along with Jim just fine. There really were. Larry Hammond never seemed to have a problem with him. Jim Salicrup didn't seem to have a problem with him. But when you're trying to make comics that won't get you fired, instead of just trying to make really good comics, because you would try to do a good comic, and everybody tried to follow his rules. They really tried to, but you never knew when somehow he was going to come up with some other thing and come in. And if you didn't just go, yes, Jim, I'll fix that. Gosh, Jim, I'm stupid. You might get fired. We really didn't know what it was. And everybody that worked on the new universe was petrified.
That's where Elliot and Jack, I think suffered from that. Right.
Well, they did get fired.
That's what I mean. I think that's that's the pincers they got trapped in, was the new universe.
Then Mike Higgins took it over. And about that point, Shooter wasn't allowed to fire anybody. So he wasn't allowed to fire Mike Higgins. So he took the books away from him.
Mm-hmm.
And he handed him over to Howard Mackey, which is how I got my job with Mark Rummel, because Howard had moved up. And Howard was petrified. He goes, well, I guess I'm the next one to get fired. But after that, Jim Shooter got fired himself. So that saved that. But everybody was trying to make the best comics they could, but it was really tough because you just didn't know when, this foot was going to come down on your neck because, you hired the wrong person, or you didn't hire somebody that he wanted hired because he was,
But
he was
there was
letter on everybody so hard that at one schedule meeting, I swear to God, Vinny was inking 20 different books. Because the schedule meetings were actually very smart because Shooter was very involved. So he knew everything was happening. And he was going down the line. Well, who's inking that? Vinny Coletta. Who's inking that? Vinny? And at one point he goes, why the hell is Vinny Coletta inking 20 books at Marvel? People said, well, Jim, you asked everybody to hire him. He goes, well, I asked you to give him some work. I didn't tell you to give him all the work. But that's the sort of overreaction that people would have. If Shooter said something,
right.
You thought, I have to do this or I will get fired.
That's
true? Probably not.
Right. That's the overreaction part of it that I was always struck by, was that Vinny example is dead on, right? Yes, Shooter wanted him to have work, but everyone just took that as, well, we can't have any other inker.
Yeah.
So common sense would say otherwise. I remember getting invited to a New Universe, meeting by accident once, because I didn't normally go to the editorial meetings, from the Marvel side. And, he was talking about the world outside your window. And everybody was just glowering and, there's no stories to be told here. And like an idiot, I sort of spoke up and said, well, there's 3 headlines in the paper today that could probably make good stories. And,
it's like Law and Order, ripped from the headlines.
Right. But that wasn't like I was smarter than anybody else, but I certainly think everybody else was so, damaged goods. And
Dan became the most popular man in the room.
Yeah, definitely. Like, go back down, to wherever you work on whatever you work on. And, but, there would then become, I think, a reactionary, aspect to it where, he couldn't say the sky is blue and have it agreed to, to my point of view.
No,
that doesn't discount anything Greg's saying either.
Yeah, so. That's 100% true. But Vinny would go around and tell editors they had to hire him, or he made sure Shooter would fire him. That wasn't true. But but everybody believed that. So people were giving, some people liked Vinny and they hired him because Vinny could, he could crank out work really fast. So it's not like, but he would go around and he would say this kind of stuff. And anybody who was friendly with Jim Shooter, people would suspect them and treat them poorly. So, I was working with Bob Layton and Dave Michelini, who were friendly with Jim Shooter. And a lot of people were like, oh, you got to watch your back with those two. They're going to tell Shooter, they're going to get fired. They were the 2 easiest guys that I had in my office, Shooter had made this declaration at one point that we were not allowed to present his opinion as his opinion to a freelancer. We had to present it as our opinion. So naturally, the first person he decided to tell me that I had to explain to them how to ink a book was Bob Layton, who immediately was like, that's your opinion? I'm like, yeah. He goes, why wasn't that your opinion, like last week when I turned the pages in and I'm trying to say something? He goes, that sounds like Jim's opinion. And I was like, all right, but I said, this is what he said. And he goes, what? So I had to now make up to Bob Layton for lying to him. He called Shooter, yelled at him for telling people to present his opinion as their opinion. Then Shooter came down and said, I never said that. And I was like, you just told me I had to do that. And I said, and I got caught. And I was like, I was not amused by that. But my editor, Mark Grunwald, he had this weird sixth sense. Every time Shooter came down to the office to complain about something, Mark was gone. So I would be stuck having to figure out,
how you have to describe your office and the platforms built into it to really understand the genius of Mark Grunwald in dealing with
Shooter's a very tall man.
Oh yeah, I saw him last year at HersheyCon. Yeah, he was a tall man.
And he would use his physical being to intimidate. So you can imagine if you're sitting at a desk and this giant, man comes in and he's not happy and he's the chief and he's just looking down at you at your little desk, you feel tiny. So Mark Grunwald decided that he built a platform. And the reason that he built the platform, of course, was so that the art files could go under it. Well, the platform had a secondary two other things. One was there was a hidden compartment in it that we would hide in at night if security came by, so we could stay and work in the office all night, or if we wanted to hide from people. But the other one was when Jim Shooter came into the office, he had to look you in the eye, and he did not like that. He liked using his height. So he would have to look, Mark Grunewald wasn't a tall guy. So now Jim Shooter's at eye level with him and eye level with me. And I decided that I didn't really like looking him in the eye. So I decided that whenever he came in, I would stand up on the platform with my head against the ceiling. So I'm looking directly down at him. And and you could see him not being, he would never say anything, but I was, this was my little psychological, okay, you're going to come in here and try to do this. I'm going to take away your psychological advantage. I can't take away the fact that you can tell me what to do. But so that with Grunewald he was always coming up with, so I don't know how he managed to know when Shooter was coming and not be in the office. But the desk platform was, it was kind of fun to have.
It was genius. It was really.
Was he hiding in the platform?
No.
He actually left.
Well, you know what? There could have been. Sometimes maybe he was. But I'm sitting at my desk, and he goes, "Oh, I'll be right back," and then he leaves, and Shooter comes in the office with the books with the pages turned sideways. I got a lot of problems with this stuff. I'm like, oh crap, But Mark had trained me to be respectful with that. But the thing is, if you actually had a problem with a story and you went to Jim Shooter, he loved solving problems. And the thing was, he would help you solve that problem. And now if once he helped you solve that problem, he was not going to bother you anymore about that. So you were much more likely, if you went to him and sought his advice on a storyline that might have gotten you in trouble before, he would be very happy to help out and get that fixed, and it would be a better story. So he, because Mark, he would say, we're going to take Jim with us to lunch for the plot conference, and I'd be like, oh no. And he would get Jim talking, and Jim would solve this problem, and then he would never bother us with that storyline, because Mark would say, go thank him for that help, and say, oh, that was really good. Then Mark figured out, let's invent problems we don't have for Jim to solve. So we would take some imaginary problem and make a big deal, like maybe we needed to fire someone. Oh no, you don't need to fire them. And then, and then we'd thank him profusely for solving a problem that hadn't existed. Yeah, Mark was really good, because Mark didn't have that many problems with him. But Mark was also part of the New Universe, writing DP7. And Mark was the only creator that really understood what Shooter was trying to do with it. And he never got bothered with it. He never had a problem doing it ever. So it could be done.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But I think that's just Mark being Mark, like that was, he just got it and just was able to articulate how a story like that could be told.
Yeah. Mark loved it. He was, and I thought that was one of the best books that came out of the whole New Universe. There's a New Universe Facebook page, and people who love it. And, I feel good that happened, because everybody really did try to make that work. Despite the fact that, the first several issues had a different creator on every one, because nobody could take, having to rewrite everything 4 times for Jim Shooter. But people tried to do a good job. So the end result, people did like it, not enough for it to last. But I thought it was a pretty good concept. I like that idea of, it's like the only weird things are the things caused by this event. And I think people, the caliber of people, because, Archie create 4 books? I think he created.
I know he created Justice, but
Justice, Night Mask, Merc, and then he.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Paul Simonson created Cyforce.
Yeah, because wasn't Shooter's wasn't he behind Starbrand?
Shooter, he came up with Starbrand.
He was Starbrand.
Elliot Brown and John Morelli came up with Spitfire and the Troubleshooters, and Tom DeFalco and Ron Friends came up with Kickers Incorporated. So you really did have a huge amount of talent, and and I'm including Jim Shooter in that, because he is a terrific writer, working on these books. At least for that first issue before they all ran screaming.
Yeah, because I remember, that seemed like one of his big things. And then, like, I was listening to an interview from 2015. I mean, I knew some of this, but, like, the whole Secret Wars thing, I know Greg brought up a while ago, Secret Wars, which, again, who was it? Was it Kenner? One of the toy companies. one of the toy companies. No, actually, I think Kenner was the DC.
Because it was a toy tie-in.
Yeah. And they
you
wanted
were
like a
at
big
a
story for
successful event,
to
yeah.
put out these Marvel
But
figures.
did
And
they drive the Secret Wars stuff, or I don't know that for a fact. I don't know that. I'm not saying it's not.
I
a
thought-
fact. I don't
well,
know that that's where it kind of came out of.
the interview I heard with
But, or
him,
was it
I
just
think
sort of the
they-
inevitable thing that you want to? Who doesn't want to see a book with everybody in it?
I think
Well,
he's,
that was what Shooter did, but it came as
Right.
it was part of a toy crossover initially that
I think
they
he,
brought it to Shooter, I guess.
I think he said they just
and
wanted
he
a
turned it into
they just
you
wanted
know,
a story. They didn't care what the story was.
yeah, but
and
he turned
then
it, I mean, it was very successful, and he
It
had
was an
Mike
event,
Beck drawing
right.
it.
and of course he
No.
assigned himself the writing of that. So
Well, yeah, I don't know how that happened, but yeah, I mean, but he did make it work.
Mhm.
You can't deny that, and I think that's where a lot of the trouble of I know better than everybody and it has to be done my way.
Because it was such a success. It was like, well, if this was such a success, of course I must be the smartest person in the universe.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
or do you think
But that
was
Secret Wars was already like in motion or over by the time we got there, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I think it
Secret
was over.
Wars.
that-
Well, I
I
don't
think
know
they
about
were
you.
moving.
the
moving
first
over
one
to
was
Secret Wars
84?
too.
Yeah, first one was 84. Second one was 85. So
Yeah, so it
Okay.
we
So it was just-
missed that. I got there just around the time the new universe was starting when I started over
Right.
at Epic. Because I remember
I mean,
we were making fun of the black border around the because
Yes.
it looked like a death like a funeral's invitation or something. Which I think you were the one that said it, and after you said that, I couldn't unsee it.
Yeah. I was snarky in those days before I got so settled. and
those days.
zen-like.
You had to be careful. The thing is, Shooter would try to be funny, and it just would backfire on him.
Oh,
Because the way he would describe stuff sometimes, because there's the famous, how do I know they're not wearing roller skates? If you didn't draw the thing. Now he wasn't really meaning that, but everybody took it that he honestly thought that there could be roller skates. Because when he said that to me, I looked him straight in the eye and I said, "Well, Jim, you draw them in a different posture if they had roller skates." And he just looked at me for a second, and then he did this sort of half smile because I was making a joke, but he understood that I understood he didn't actually mean the roller skates. He just thought it was important to see, a full figure every once in a while, which is you do, storytelling things. You do want to see that. It's not always necessary to see their feet, because frankly, if they were wearing roller skates, you would show the roller skates because that would be important. Normally,
Right.
it really doesn't matter what what shoes.
But it's right. It's part of the ultimate like establishment of certain characteristics and tenets.
But you don't
for that
have
first time
to.
reader. No.
But he would make it seem like if you didn't do it, and again, you're going to be fired if you don't show the feet.
But it's also, I can understand it with what, if you're working with people who are going to just egregiously break the rules and not even think about the rules, you could sort of understand the need to sort of put down, direct things like that. But to the point earlier, I think, it just then becomes, well, this works perfectly well without having to incorporate that rule to the letter. But his point of view seemed to be that it had to be to the letter always.
Well, because
And that's where it would be a problem. But-
new artists would make a lot of these errors, so they didn't understand the kindergarten rules, and once you understand them, you can break them because he never seemed to have a problem with anything Bill Sienkiewicz did, which always bewildered me because Bill's stuff was so out there, it was so insane and so cool and so awesome, it just was right for him to hate. But he never seemed to have a problem with anything Bill did. He seemed to really like what Bill did. He was always annoyed that he couldn't tame Walt Simonson, but he didn't really have any issues with Walt. So there were people that he didn't really have trouble with.
I have to ask Bill about that. You have to sort of wonder if it was like Bill's guileless facade of like, yeah, it's cool, like sort of just found it like, whereas Walt would be, I think, a little bit more like, WTF or whatever. Bill has that skill of like agreeability, even though, I'm just going to go and do it. I'm just going to go and be Bill. So I have to ask him about
there's just, sometimes I didn't understand How come he didn't have a problem with this person or that person? I mean, I never had any problem with anything Bill Sienkiewicz ever did. I just loved his work.
I thought maybe when you said Sienkiewicz, I thought maybe at first it was going to be, if someone, stuff got really popular right away, maybe he gave them kind of a free pass. But Walt Simonson, whose stuff was very popular also. So I guess that theory's out the window.
That was the problem. It was hard to read Shooter sometimes, because he would like stuff that you would think he wouldn't like. And then there was that, you were trying desperately to make the comic you thought he would like, and then he would just hate it. And and he wasn't, I never thought he was very good at communicating exactly what it was that was wrong. Because every time he brought stuff back to my office and said stuff, all I kept wanting to say is, you're out of your fucking mind. Because it just didn't make any sense to me. And he would criticize people that, and he would say, well, you have to call this person up. I'm like, no, I'm not calling Tom Palmer up and telling him how to ink. That's not happening. You can do it. It was stuff like that would just baffle me. It's like, what would make you think I have any, I don't even have any, at that time, I had no credibility. How am I going to call, Tom Palmer's a masterful inker, no, that's just not going to happen. I mean, I never even told Tom about that story. I was like, there's no way that he needs to hear that, the day that Jim Shooter said, I think Tom Palmer's lost his ability to ink. He doesn't know how to use black.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a fun day. So I actually went to John Romita and showed him the pages, and I was like, this is what Jim Shooter told me. And Romita's eyes like rolled in the back of his head, and he said he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then he proceeded to explain to me just exactly why Tom Palmer was a master and brilliant. So the good thing about that was I got this lovely hour and a half free lecture from John Romita Sr. about, how great Tom Palmer was. But, that was the nice thing, because you could always go to John, and I would always ask him questions like, well, Jim Shooter told me this, and what do you think,
Right. But interestingly, you would do that. You would get a different perspective, or, a larger informed perspective, and then could probably use that even to counter Jim. And I wonder how many other people would actually do that, and just rather than just kind of roll or be overly annoyed about it. Right.
Well, I know. So, I never used anything I learned from John Romita to put Jim Shooter in his place. No.
Well, not necessarily putting him in his place, in that exact way, but sort of then be able to, because I'm sure in much the same way that Archie had a certain cachet and power, by it being Archie's opinion on something, I'm sure that John Romita's opinion on something would have a certain sway.
Of course. That's why I was like, well, if anybody's going to talk to Tom Palmer, it should be John Romita. He's the only one that's got enough clout to tell him anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I certainly did. I told Jim, I said, well, maybe you should call him up. I said, I'm sure you have a much better clout than I do. And he didn't want to do that. It's like, it was fine for me to call Tom Palmer and tell him how to ink, without saying Jim Shooter told me to call you. But he didn't want to do that all by himself.
Was it just Jim didn't, I don't know, did he have trouble thinking outside the box? Like, oh, I wouldn't do this, so maybe
no idea.
There's no rhyme or reason.
I feel like he had Vinnie Coletta in his ear, and again, he was sometimes just so focused on these kindergarten rules that, there are people that know how to break the rules. I mean, that's when you're learning to do stuff, you do stuff the baby steps way, and then at some point you learn there's hundreds of ways to do the exact same thing. It's like if you look at Frank Miller's Daredevil run, he does very simple storytelling showing that you can do things like that, but but there's a lot of complexity to the way he did. Even Kirby, it's 6-panel grids, but what he put in those is amazing. So stuff can be done, but when someone is telling you have to do this and this is exactly how it has to be done, it's taking away your ability to decide how to do that close up or how to establish a shot, and you're just going for the most generic thing ever. And then when you did it, which is what he asked you to do, he would not like it, and you just like, I don't know what to do, because you got mad when the artist did this interesting angle, and now you're mad that he did the angle you told him to do. So it was you didn't quite you didn't know when you were going to get in trouble.
That's crazy stressful. I can't believe you kept at it.
Because we loved the comics, and sometimes it was, I mean, we were lucky. I mean, our office, honestly, we had, Roger Stern, John Buscema, and Tom Palmer on the Avengers. Most of the time that kind of sailed through. We had Dave Michelini, Mark Bright, and Bob Layton on Iron Man. Most of the time that would kind of sail through. And then we had Steve Englehart, Al Milgram, and Joe Sinnott on the West Coast Avengers. And most of the time, that would go through. I mean, we had creators that understood the basics, established their shots, weren't doing insane, crazy storytelling. So it would go through. But then I decided that I would hire Kevin Nolan for something. And, he lost his mind. It's like, well, this doesn't look like anything else. And I went, right, that's why I hired Kevin Nolan. But, and he just couldn't handle that it didn't look this standard sort of way. He didn't like style, except for Bill Sienkiewicz. So it was, you just didn't know, and I was like, I don't know what to tell you. How can you not love Kevin Nolan's work? Because I came from Epic. When I started Epic, the stuff that they did at Epic was just, I mean, it was epic. It was so much of everything I think comics should have been, but you couldn't do that on the Marvel side. You couldn't
until you could, and then you had people complaining about it.
Well,
people internally complaining about it.
Like, what are you doing here? Why are you getting this guy to paint a cover?
This would sell so much better if it looked like an ordinary comic.
Oh yeah. Why? Okay. Well, like they were because when I got we got Kent Williams to do one of the Deathlock covers on the limited series. They were like, what the hell is this? Why didn't Joe Jusko just do all the covers? I'm like, I don't know, because we thought it would be fun to have different people, because Bill did one, and Kent did one, and Joe Jusko did one, and then Dennis Cowan did one himself.
I mean, was Jim a lot of his decisions based on business too? Because didn't he have like a hand with like the distributors and stuff? And I think he had issues with like the direct market, maybe.
Literally said he didn't care about the sales. He was he really, really wanted the best comics. That's what he thought. As long as but his version of the best comics did not mesh with
a
lot of other people's version of the best comics. So when you had that collision, that was where the problem was. Perhaps if everybody had just done everything Jim's way, everything would have been really awesome. But creators don't tend, once you're freelance, you don't tend to want to do everything this one specific way. You kind of want to be creative.
But that's a critical thing, I think you just said. In this being what do you call this? The life and career of Jim Shooter. Yes. It's certainly easy and in some cases valid, to sort of pick on the guy. But I do think it was driven by his desire to do the best comics, which is a distinction from some other people, right? Other people are just universal jerks, for being universal jerks.
Yeah.
And that's, whatever way he approached things, whatever revisionist history, he may have portrayed in the way that he sort of, talked up certain things. I think, it was driven by somebody who wanted to do, really great comics.
Yeah, I agree. That's, it's just what he liked wasn't what maybe we wanted to do, but, he wasn't trying to just be a jerk. I don't think that was ever the case. And, and you have to kind of also look at, he was one of the people that was responsible for getting creators' rights, getting people royalties, getting people creator royalties, getting artwork returned, making sure people got insurance. There were times when he took money out of his wallet to give it to creators who couldn't pay their rent or something. So there's this other sort of side to him that I don't think doesn't get talked about as often. And some of the people that he helped out are some of the people that were the most critical of him at other times. I mean, one thing doesn't really have enough to do, but he was, I don't think he was a bad guy. It just, his manner of dealing with his staff, after Secret Wars, where, Carl Potts put it when we kind of stormed his office, a whole bunch of us, and 2 or 3 editors talked, but Carl had said, how did we go from being the greatest creative staff on the planet to the biggest idiots you've ever met? Because that's how he treated the staff at that point. I was only there at the end, so I never got to see this other version of Jim where he basically saved Marvel Comics and got all this other stuff going. So I didn't see that. But he used to talk about, we have the greatest staff of all time. But by the time we got there, we didn't feel like that's how he felt. And I thought that was an interesting question when Carl, asked that question. And Shooter seemed very surprised by that question, but he never answered it when he asked him.
I know I've heard people say, oh, he put himself on Secret Wars for like the royalties and stuff. I mean, do you think maybe he wanted Secret Wars to say, okay, here, I wrote the Bible. A lot of the big characters are in here, so, write Spider-Man the way I wrote Spider-Man, write the Avengers the way I wrote the Avengers, write the Fantastic Four the way I wrote the Fantastic Four.
Maybe, or he may have thought he was the only one that knew all of these characters well enough to do it, or maybe nobody wanted it. Sometimes people wound up with, stuff because nobody else wanted to do it. I don't know.
I mean, think about the Transformers, nobody wanted to touch that thing when he was shopping it around. Bob Budiansky, agreed to do it. And Bob, has become forever identified with an amazing property because, he defined that world and then so many of the characters. So that could have been the case. But the only person, Phil, who could probably answer that question is Jim. So,
yeah.
Unless somebody else was there.
So I don't know if he assigned himself Secret Wars or if, he assigned it to an editor and the editor said, gosh, Jim, you're the only one that can, write this. I mean, I can completely see, if he was already being so controlling, the thought of, hiring somebody that Jim was going to be able to tolerate writing all of the characters, the easiest thing to do was to have him do it. And he did a good job with it, so, I wouldn't, it's like, having written like Spider-Man a couple times, it was horrible because, with all, because there's so much pressure to write it the specific way and you can't do anything you want. It was just like, try to, just imagine writing all of them.
Yeah. And so many of those characters, right?
Imagine it. So I don't know, maybe somebody else wanted it.
I don't know if this is just a line or not, but I think in the interview he said, he'd be seen as playing favorites if he assigned someone else to do that.
That sounds like a line.
Probably, but yeah.
That sounds like a line.
But everybody does that. Every editor has their favorite people that they hire, and maybe.
And if he did assign it to himself, then that would be, I don't know, like it's not like there aren't moments where we've all tried to kind of like do something for a brass ring. I mean, anyone who looked at that rationally, has to see it's going to be a home run. Right? The first time something like that was done, I think, at that scale, with a kind of a built-in, of course everyone's going to want this, no matter what it is. Could have been the shittiest thing on the planet, and that was going to sell like gangbusters.
Yeah, because it's tied to toy lot. It's tied to toys, and those they were promoting those on television, TV commercials and stuff. So,
but I wouldn't have wanted to be the guy that wrote that and then it failed.
No.
Right.
If Jim Shooter wrote it and it failed, it wasn't gonna, he wasn't gonna fire himself from the company.
Right. But it's kind of at that point, it would be hard to imagine how it could possibly have failed. Nowadays, maybe.
He's a very good writer, and they had Mike Zeck as the artist. So, it had a really good team. You cannot take away that Jim Shooter is a very good writer. You just can't. That's no matter what else you think, he can write his ass off, and he's been doing it longer than and none of the rest of us were writing comics when we were 14 that was published.
Yeah,
I mean, and like Dan said too. I mean, it's gonna sell because that was like the first. I think was that the first big Marvel story where it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna throw most of the heroes together.
I think it was the first big giant crossover like that. Period. Maybe
Crisis on Infinite Earth. Like I think that
might have been like a year later. So yeah, Secret Wars.
Did that come after it?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. No, because Crisis happened when we were on staff.
Oh, okay. My time mixed up.
Do you want me to check?
It's really hard.
If it helps.
This happened.
Well, Crisis I think was 85 and 86, and the first Secret Wars was 84. So yeah, it should have.
Yeah, it would have been before.
Okay.
Oh no,
I'll go with that.
Jim Shooter set the bar.
Well, he did set a lot of bar.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
that's the thing. You can't take that away from the guy. Even after he left Marvel, I mean, Valiant was a big success.
Yeah.
After that, not so much. But to bounce back after being fired from Marvel to found another company that was a big that they had some stuff. They were competition for Marvel and DC. They weren't fooling around, and there was some really terrific stuff that came out of it. I think didn't you work on some of the Valiant stuff, Dan?
After he left, I did some Valiant stuff with when Fabian was there, and Jeff Gomez was there, but that was after he moved on. But I did some stuff for him at Defiant.
Yeah.
He brought me in for some stuff on Defiant, and there's an argument by him, that Defiant would have been more successful if Marvel hadn't come after them for that, whatever it was,
Warriors
Plasma
of
or
Was that it?
Warriors of Plasma, something, and they said it was a copyright infringement on something they had done, and which could have been true. I don't know, but they certainly came after him with guns blazing.
Oh
And,
yeah. Well, anything he did, that was the thing. If Jim Shooter was doing it, Marvel was coming after Jim Shooter.
Right.
It was not fair, but the hatred that was coming at him because of what had happened at Marvel from a lot of people, there was a lot of unfair stuff coming at him, and he let it bounce off him and kept forming new companies. Our mutual pal Dwayne McDuffie actually really enjoyed working with Jim Shooter.
Mhm.
Dwayne, who helped form Milestone, probably one of the greatest writers out there. But he had nothing but the best things to say about Jim
Dwayne
Shooter.
was also one of the only people who could actually look Jim in the eye without being on a platform, so that probably helped too.
And arguably, Dwayne was way smarter than everybody. And,
Oh yeah.
and so I'm sure Jim was not about to intimidate Dwayne. But Dwayne, he was the guy that would listen to stuff. I think sometimes when Shooter talked, people just turned off and said, he's wrong no matter whether he's right or not.
Well, that's it, right? I think there was a degree of that
Not
from
fair.
my one step removed experience.
All right. I was gonna say we can cut it here soon, but do you gentlemen have any final thoughts? Anything we haven't covered about Mr. Shooter? Or
No, I mean, I feel like we've picked at him a lot, and as Greg sort of said at the beginning, my experience was largely positive, recognizing what he was also causing amongst people I knew and people I was friends with in Marvel proper. But I always had very good interaction with them and found a lot to admire about him, which I said to him in years later, and when I finally saw him again when I started coming back to conventions. It was enjoyable to see him at shows, but I would also catch revisionist history from him, just kind of talking about things. He seemed to, with all his accomplishments, and that was always what was perplexing to me. Like, his accomplishments were significant and real, and demonstrably, in some ways, well beyond what any single person, many single people, probably had made happen. Yet he always seemed to want to embellish them more. Like there was more being added onto it. But I didn't question that in the moments I had to sort of like chat with him at conventions, like even at Hershey, where you guys saw him, Phil, and but to me he was a pretty amazing influence, at a time when I was trying to figure a lot of stuff out, and I was very grateful for the chance to to work with him and work around him, and certainly, no pun intended, stands tall in the people that I, did have that kind of interaction with. So to me, it's a net positive, and it's one of those things where, a lot of people are passing away now. You're losing people just because of time and age, but, certainly, seeing him go, brought a lot of things to the fore, for me.
I think he's going to be much better remembered for all the really good positive stuff that he did, because when you kind of look at his very long career. The problems at Marvel was a kind of a short, nasty little part, but did all this stuff, and the fans don't really care about most of that other stuff. They care that he wrote Secret Wars, or that he wrote stuff at DC, or that he created this stuff. He helped found Valiant, and then they see all this work that came out at Marvel while he was there. And yes, he did have an influence over some of the work that John Byrne and Chris Claremont did on the X-Men, and Frank Miller getting into Daredevil, and Walt Simonson, and the very beginnings of Epic Comics. So he did, he deserves that credit for that. And I think that's how he will ultimately be remembered. That he did a lot of really good stuff. And the fans won't really care. It's just this group of us that was at Marvel at that one particular time. And I kind of try to put it out of my mind, but I didn't really want to talk to him when I saw him. It just brought up stuff.
Right.
But I was very sad when I found out he was sick. I thought that was terrible. Because he was this big. He's a legend. You can't get away from that. And to see a legend start to crumble a bit physically, it was hard. And he was out there even when he was sick because he really liked the fans. He really enjoyed talking to the fans, meeting the fans, telling stories. But he was he really was. He was there for the fans. He was there for the readers, despite our troubles with him. He really wanted it for the readers. And he one of the big things he says, every comic could be somebody's first, and you have to write it like that. And that's something that Tom DeFalco would say as well. But it's true. If you pick up a comic, you don't know what's going on, you're done reading comics.
I would add something you just said there, Greg, or build on it rather. And I do hope he's remembered better, because right now there's good remembrances, but there's also a bunch of shit talkers, for the sake of shit talking. I mean, a couple of them, I had to hold back from you're just, excuse me, fucking going off for no good reason, except here's your chance, to say a bunch of stuff about a guy who died yesterday. But whatever the, relationship, and situation was, between, him and Archie, he was, to my mind, Jim, always incredibly supportive of that line of creator-owned books.
Yeah.
And, one of the first people, I think, to really take that stance, of creator ownership really seriously. Now, there may have been a strategic reason around that, but, that should not be discounted either. I mean, clearly Archie was the point of the spear on that, or the whole spear. But, Jim was, there was never a question from him about the value of, people owning their properties in that instance. And that was a big deal.
Yeah.
To have that sort of sense of support, which did not feel as strong, after he left. I mean, his leaving, began the decay of Epic, which would ultimately, I think force Archie out and Archie to go to DC. There was not that sense that what you're doing at Epic and this creator-owned stuff, has a standalone import, or that it should be treated any differently than anything else. And that changed demonstrably after Jim.
Oh yeah, big time.
I mean, so I think that's, to me, that's one of the biggest things, that he should also be considered for in what he represented, and what, holding that line as much as anything else.
You brought something else up. One of the things that Jim really valued loyalty, and creators who maybe were not in the best shape, or they're not getting jobs. He would make sure that they had work at Marvel, and that's why he was pushing Vinny Colletti. But Vinny, he's been around, he should have work. He didn't mean for him to have all the work, but he did. He made sure that creators who'd been loyal to Marvel, that they had work, and you don't see that today. They don't care. None of the companies care. It's like, if they want the newest whatever. So people that have been doing this for years and years, it's like, when was the last time you saw Jerry Ordway do something? There's a lot of guys that they're still doing good. They can still do great work. They are not getting that. Jim Shooter would never have allowed any of these guys to just whittle away. If they were, if you were willing to work, I said he would make sure that people had work. And he would. I remember going around offices, and say, these people here need some work. You have any work for them? And that's a big deal. He valued that loyalty, and yeah, that's another. Again, there's a lot of positives, with our little picky things. I think that's how he'll be remembered. I think he will be remembered.
I would hope so. I would really hope so. I hope that that there's more of that in the long run. I mean, a lot of people have called him complicated, even and then said positive things. And I think that's that there's real truth to that.
Yeah.
But I would hope the positive things are also not erasing the complications, but that the complications don't erase the positive things about him.
Well, see, I like to use the word complicated because there's stuff that I experienced that was not good. That was really bad.
Well, no, I know that.
And that is good. So it's not this one-dimensional thing.
No.
Yeah, there's this part, but then there's all this other good stuff. So, it's
right.
and prior to our arrival there was a whole other version of Jim Shooter that people really liked.
Right. Right.
So, you could see the pictures where, there's a lot of camaraderie and all kinds of really great stuff. I didn't see that, unfortunately, but so yeah,
but you did get some fruit soap out of it, though, as I recall. And we're not going to tell you that story, but unless Greg wants to go down that road, but I'm not going to go down that.
I still don't quite understand where that one came from, but okay.
I understand it. I think I understand it.
All right,
fruit soap.
All right, we'll stop on fruit soap.
All right.
Right into the band that they tell the story of fruit soap. All right. All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Greg, you want to promote what you're doing?
Like what am I allowed? Okay. The thing I can really promote is we're winding up. We're almost finishing up Escape from Monster Island, Graham Nolan's creator-owned book. We're not that many pages from being done. Ron Wagner and I are finishing up our secret, really violent Western book that he and I are actually co-coloring, it'll be interesting when people see that. And then I've got a secret project at DC that I can't really talk about. That when it finally comes out, I think a lot of people will be very happy with it. But I can't really talk about it other than it's a secret, and it's pretty cool, and I'm thrilled to be working on it. I think that's about it.
All right, Dan, you want to promote your stuff that you talk about every month on the Chichester Chats?
Well, I'll just push down on Risk right now, which is a cyberpunk thriller from Black Box. I believe issue 3 is out or just about to be out. 5-issue series. You can find it from your local comic shop, hopefully. If not, go to blackboxcomics.net and you can order it directly from there. It's a lot of fun. Looks great. Good energy, good inner outer weaves in that cyberpunky kind of way. So please check it out, and more to talk about on the next Chichester Chats about that, I guess.
That is a really good looking book.
It is.
Oh, yeah.
I'll get you. I'll autograph a copy for you next Wednesday. So.
Greg, he'll give you the friends and family discount, $5.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, wait! Isn't there a book that was published recently, Dan? That you have out there?
Oh, yeah.
I do?
Yeah. Isn't there a book about writing?
Oh, well, yes, that's true, too. I totally forgot about that. Yes, so there's a book called Street Writers, which is an assembly of all my 2.5-year podcast about writing, which is a lot of fun. You can find it on Amazon, print on demand. So it's 100-plus tips and tricks about writing, and includes myself, my co-host Mark Belushi, who's another award-winning creative from advertising and a playwright, as well as interviews and tips from everything from comic book writers to game developers to Oscar winners to public relations guys who also happen to be convicts in prison. So it's an eclectic, grouping of people with quick moments to kind of get yourself motivated and pushing your writing forward.
In your Substack newsletter, which is always good.
And there's that. Yeah, you can do that too. So
Gosh, Dan, you have
storymaze.substack.com. I do have lots going on.
Isn't
And that project with Greg, which we might get off the
Kickstarter
ground
that's
too.
pre-launch as well?
What's that?
Isn't there a Kickstarter and pre-launch?
We're gonna, yes, there is, but we're leaving that alone for the moment. I'll tell you why later.
That's his secret project. Shh.
That's my not so secret project. But if you look at the little thing under my name, you can figure it out yourself. So
Oh yeah, there it is.
yeah, I know how to promote myself. Sort of.
Kind of.
That
All
the
right.
tiny URL is very tiny font as well.
Tiny URL in this quadrant thing, yes. it's
What?
true.
Explain this tiny URL thing. I don't understand that.
It's easier to, because
It's a way to shrink
that
down the
goes
web.
direct-
The
that
web.
goes- that goes direct
address.
to the Kickstarter
Yeah.
link, but it shrinks it down from the Kickstarter /6973489 / whatever Axel's Infernal.
Huh.
It just kind of condenses it that
Just
way.
makes a shorter address. Yeah.
I've been wondering what that is for like a couple of years and never bothered to ask anybody that
Yeah, it's like Bitly.
So it's
if
like
you've
an
ever used Bitly.
abbreviation.
Yeah, it just makes it
Just
shorter,
allows it to
yeah.
shorten it. You could also just go to axelsinfernal.com and also get that too.
It's
But
true. It's a really nice
maybe
stuff up there.
Yeah. Come on, we need number 2. All right. Well, yeah. Again, thank you, gentlemen. I know you're busy
thank
men.
you for doing this. Thanks for giving Jim some airtime.
Yeah, he deserves some accolades. He really does.